Okay, welcome back. In this chapter, we're going to review the key elements of the first three lessons that we looked at. We're going to create a new project and use that to examine each of the track types in detail. We'll also look at some tips, tricks, and troubleshooting. So, I have Cubase up and running. Let's use the File New Project command to get started. That's going to open the Steinberg hub, and as you've probably already determined, there's a number of templates you can choose from at the top, including empty. Now let's go ahead and take the Steinberg recording tab here. Let's scroll down to, let's use the piano and vocal template for this. And I'm going to hit create. And the first thing it wants to know, of course, is where are we going to put this project folder so it knows where to stream the audio. And navigate to the desktop, and I've already created a dummy project here that we'll be using for several different lessons for a fictitious commercial for a place called Flyby Resorts. And I want to take just 30 seconds and make a recommendation on project structure. We're going to look at folder structure in Chapter 8 in detail, but the way that we organize projects here is with a master folder for the client, so that anything having to do with this commercial or that album or whatever the project is has a place to live. Within that client's master folder, we'll have at least three subfolders. This is visual elements, so any video and imagery that they may send, sonic elements or audio that they may send over. In this case, we have a foreign language voiceover that we'll work with, and then a folder to contain all of the project files that we're going to generate. So within the project files directory, I'm going to create a folder for this Cubase project, and we'll call it Flyby Music Theme Song, and hit create. And we'll come back to this particular project folder later and see all the stuff that's going on inside of it. But if you keep your projects organized in compartmentalized fashion like that, it will prevent getting all of your audio files and MIDI tracks mixed together. If you throw everything into one giant My Music folder, things will work well for a number of months, and then you're going to need to move something or extract something, and it's become the audio equivalent of a junk drawer. Okay, so it's going to go ahead and set all this up, and my goodness, look at that! What a mess! This is the desktop layout that Steinberg had programmed for this template, but that's okay because we saved a workspace called Project Window Only, and we'll bounce over to that because we're going to spend all of our time in this view here. So the next thing I'm going to do is just quickly make sure that our setup is correct. I'm going to move down to the Device Setup menu and check out our VST system, and what a surprise, it defaulted to the AirPlay mode, which is not what we want. No problem, we're going to switch that back to our Steinberg driver, our Steinberg audio interface. And I'm going to come down one layer and just check that out and make sure everything's the way I want it. One thing we didn't talk about in Chapter 2 is buffer size. If you click the control panel, it's going to open up this dialog and allow you to choose how many samples of buffer you have on your incoming audio stream. And this is, there's no right answer here. I would recommend 512 to start out with. The smaller the buffer size becomes, the less working memory the computer has. The processing is faster, but you run the risk of dropouts and errors. If you go the other way and you use a really generous buffer, the audio is going to come in seamlessly, but there's going to be a delay. There's going to be latency associated with it. So if you have a singer or a player that's listening back to their stuff in real time, that can cause a problem because there's a hesitation. If you select a given buffer size, it'll tell you over here on the other menu what the input and output latency is, and it's 12 milliseconds at 512. This is going to depend on your system. If you have a screaming fast computer, you can get away with a smaller buffer size. And I'll just say that during mixdown, and you're no longer worried about real-time monitoring, using a much larger buffer size is going to unload the computer. Your system will perform a little better, and there's no problem with latency latency at that stage of the project. So we have our outermost layer, the ASIO layer, set up correctly. The next thing we're going to look at are VST connections within the software itself. I'm going to use F4 to bring that VST connections window up in one click, and darn it, the connections have all failed. And this isn't uncommon when you're changing drivers, as we just did, but fortunately, we went in here before and saved a preset, so I can simply click my default, and then everything is reconnected and labeled properly. So now we get down to the tracks themselves, and we'll take just a closer look at each one. Before we do that, let me just point out, if we go to the documentation option under help and open the operation manual, if you search on tracks, it's going to take you to this part of the manual. And there are pages and pages of information here. This is both good and bad. They go through, as you can see, every single icon in every single track, and they define it for you. What you're not going to get a lot of in the manual is how to use it or why it's there, and that's what we're going to try to provide here in this and the subsequent or the following chapter. So let's dig in just a little deeper on track types. Okay, so if we right-click in the track list, this floating window pops up and allows us to add any of the types of tracks in Cubase. Two things I want to point out. The icon at the beginning of each type here, that icon is used throughout Cubase. So anything related to audio is going to have this icon associated with it. Anything related to MIDI will have that icon. So Media Bay, Loop Browser, and so forth that can make finding your way around a little more efficient. Big picture before detail. Think about you really have two families here. You have content tracks and then you have control tracks. Now, those are my terms, but the audio, instrument, and MIDI tracks, those are actually going to have musical information in them. And things like the chord track, arrangers, markers, tempo tracks, those are control items. They don't contain any musical data per se. They control information or commands that are going to modify or control the tracks which do. Let's go ahead and we'll just create another audio track here and create one. We'll make it we'll take it a mono configuration, and we'll call this voiceover, and I'll show you why in a minute. And new in 8.5, we can set its routing right here. Now, at the moment, I have a 5.1 surround bus setup going on, as well as just a standard stereo output, which I've called main. So we'll send it to the main output and hit add track. Now, with any of your content tracks, and let's talk primarily audio, MIDI, and instrument track, they're going to need an input and an output. And that's going to be set in this very first tab over the inspector. Now, if we go up to the first audio track here that the template gave us, the vocals track, at the moment this is set with no input bus and no output bus. Probably the most common complaint from a new user is, I'm not getting any sound. This is probably the biggest offender, is you have to connect that track to something, both in and out, in order for it to work. And in the case of a audio track, the input and outputs, the sources and the courses are going to be buses. And for an instrument or MIDI track, they're going to be devices. So we go to the first audio track, and let's connect this. Here's all of our busing options. These are all the things that we set up in that the F4 VST connections. And let's use the voiceover mic, which happens to be the one that I'm talking into at the moment, and you'll see why in a second. And we also need to send that somewhere, and we'll send this to the main output again. The new track we just created is already headed there because we set that when we brought it to life. So if there's one other culprit that gives new users fits, it's this monitor icon, the little speaker. This has to be enabled in order to hear the incoming signal. So keep your eye on this meter to the right. As I'm speaking, you can see it bouncing around there. If I disable that, now the performer wouldn't be able to hear the incoming signal. So you back to the top, we'll enable that and record a few measures, and you'll see the waveform is reflecting everything that I'm saying here in real time, which means the performer would hear and so forth. And everybody's happy. Then you stop, you go back to the top, and I'm going to hit playback and watch the audio meter there. And that translates into the performer saying, I can't hear anything. What you have to do to hear the playback is turn that off. So that's probably one of the single biggest troubleshooting issues right there, is the busing and the monitor icon. Now, when we come down to an instrument track, and again, looking at that icon in the corner, we can identify that at a glance as an instrument track. That means we're going to have a MIDI input routed to a VST device of some kind, and it's going to take care of routing the audio from that in the background automatically. If I open up the routing tab here, it's the same basic icon. You've got the arrow coming into the box, but if for an audio track, it's going to display the available buses. For an instrument or MIDI track, it's going to display the available MIDI inputs. And you're probably safest just selecting all MIDI inputs there. We also need to send it somewhere, and this is going to be our various choices of VST or Virtual Studio Instruments inside. And let's just send it to Halion Sonic SE. And of course, that's going to open the user interface right away so we can play with it. Okay, another option to speed things up is the ability to use what's called a track preset. And track presets are going to come preloaded with all sorts of settings to help you get to the final result faster. And if we take a look at the this voiceover track that we created from scratch, none of the tabs over here in the inspector have anything enabled on them. It's a completely blank slate. But if you look at the vocal track that came from the Steinberg template, it has several of these tabs already pre-configured. So if we look in the Inserts tab, we can see they put a compressor on. And if we open its editor, well, that compressor looks about right for a vocal track. And the same for the equalizers and even the sends. There's already a reverb that's been configured for this track. And the way you would access that is to take the option of Add Track using Track Preset. And when you click that, it's going to open a sort of specialized view of Media Bay. And let's take just a quick tour of this, because this same basic format or this same basic layout occurs throughout Cubase anytime you're searching for anything. And I'm going to clear the filters here. This little reset icon is going to take you back to square one. Now, in using this view of Media Bay, we're going to work from left to right, selecting attributes. And then in the right-hand side here, we're going to see our called the results pane, everything that fits our request. Now, at the moment, you can see the upper right-hand corner shows a number of 4871. That's how many total track presets Media Bay has in its library. And that's a lot to pick through. So we have track preset. The first column here is media type. We have track presets for audio tracks. We have track presets for instrument, MIDI, etc. So obviously, in this case, we're going to use audio. And for the sake of argument, let's say we're recording an electric bass guitar for a rock band. We can move over and select a specific category, in this case, bass. And notice that each time we add a different filter on the front end, the number of results drops dramatically, down to from 4,000 or whatever to 27. Now, we said this was going to be an electric bass, and it's going to be for a rock band. So I've told Media Bay what I'm looking for in descending order. I want an audio track preset for an electric bass with the rock genre, and it said, of my 4,000 some possibilities, 9 fit your request, and they're these. And look at that. This one has a 5-star rating. Now, this rating system, this is like the stars on iTunes. You can put whatever you want there. You find something you like, it makes it easier to find in the future. You can click on these column names, and it'll, if you click on the, column header name, it'll alphabetize it one way or the other. Ratings, it'll organize them by that criteria. And if you have additional column headings, you can sort by any of those. But let's assume the bright bass is the one that we want. And if I hover over that, it's going to call up the full name of that file, and you see that it says AM bass 1 direct input rock M, presumably metal. That AM means this is one of the track presets that was developed by Alan Morgan, who, if you're not familiar with that name, he's all over the Cubase content. He was one of the producers for Taylor Swift, so he's got some real credibility behind his contributions here. And we'll go ahead and we're going to add that track, and you'll notice that the bright bass track appears. It's an audio track, and several of these tabs have settings pre-applied. So there's already a VST Dynamics insert. If we open the editor, well, that looks about right. That's pretty close to what most electric bass guitar compressor setups look like. And to that end, you can use these track presets a couple of different ways. Obviously, this will help you get ready to record an electric bass, and you'll come out closer to the final answer right out of the gate. You can also use this just simply to peruse the settings and look at how, a professional who does this day in and day out chose to set up a compressor for a bass guitar. Same thing for the equalizer here. And in fact, if you click the associated E for any of these tracks, you'll get the channel settings editor. There's a whole chapter on this thing coming up. This gives you a summary of all the various settings for that particular track in one control panel, but you can use this as a training tool as well as just applying it to your stuff. You can also access those track presets for an existing track. If I take our, let's take our raw, the voiceover track down here that we created that has nothing turned on in the inspector. If I right-click that and come down here and say load track preset, we're going to end up in this same window, and then we clear all those filters again, and we'll pick vocal because that's a voiceover track. We'll say spoken word, classical, and let's come down and pick spoken words, basic, male. And now suddenly these tabs have illuminated because it's thrown in a compressor pre-configured for spoken word. It's thrown in an equalizer and so forth. And we're going to come back to that preset concept repeatedly. You can do that with entire channels, with the mixing console, all kinds of stuff. And it really helps you move along faster. And again, you can teach yourself a lot about it. So